Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. For those of you who do not know what Impetus Digital is we're a company that has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous collaboration tools for pharmaceutical, medical device, and healthcare companies. We actually help companies with everything from advisory boards to co-author working groups to investigator meetings. And unfortunately, since COVID-19, a lot of people have had to virtualize internal meetings like brand planning, POA rollouts, and Salesforce trainings, and all sorts of other things. At Impetus Digital, we really believe that everything starts with a thought, and that thought turns into a conversation. And sometimes those conversations can be really courageous and really provocative. And that really, in an essence, is what this fireside chat or these conversations are. We want to become, at Impetus, the bridge, if you will, for having some of these big, hairy, audacious plans, ideas, innovations, creations. And we want to be able to speak to provocateurs and innovators and creationists who are doing something that's really, truly positively disruptive in healthcare. And at the end of the day, it starts with these conversations. So I'm really thrilled and honored to have somebody that I've been really interested in wanting to speak to in a while. His name is Leo Grady, and he is here. He is the CEO of a really innovative company. We're going to dig into that today, on a company called Paige. And they use cutting edge artificial intelligence to help pathologists improve the efficacy and efficiency of their work. So they also help researchers generate new insights and help clinicians improve patient care. Leo has a really interesting background. We're going to dig in there a little bit, but he is a technology leader who brings the latest artificial intelligence, computer vision, and medical imaging technology to the healthcare market. And he does this through a lot of innovative products, and we're going to talk about what Paige does today. He actually has a PhD in cognitive and neural systems from the Boston University. And before joining Paige, he was the senior vice president of engineering at HeartFlow Incorporated. And before that, he actually worked as a principal research scientist at Siemens. So he's got a lot of technology background, and obviously in the medical space as well. So it's obviously put him in a really great position to be where he is today, which is the CEO of Paige. So welcome, Leo. So happy to have you here today.
Thank you, Natalie. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's awesome. Wanted to see if we can dig a little bit, maybe to start off with your background. You were a researcher, you worked at Siemens, you were working on, you have a PhD in cognitive and neural systems. How did all of that culminate into you working, and I'm assuming that you were one of the co-founders of Paige as well. What brings you to the table, and how did you get to Paige in the first place?
So I'm not a co-founder of Paige. I was actually brought in after the company was founded because the founders were really looking for somebody who had both an understanding of the technology and of the way to bring new products to market in a healthcare space where there wasn't already a playbook. And so that's how we got connected. The founder of Paige, Thomas Fuchs, and myself gave back-to-back talks at a conference about 2 years ago. And then we went out to dinner, and that led one thing to another until I ended up joining.
That's fantastic. So where do you use your cognitive and neural systems, PhD work? Is it something that you integrated it? And what talk did you give that was so interesting to Fuchs?
Well, it's funny because back when I finished my PhD, it was almost 20 years ago, and the term AI was not what it is today. So BU had one of the first programs in this space, and they called it cognitive and neural systems. But the technology that we were studying was really exactly the same as what we think of as modern AI. It was 20 years earlier, but it was exactly an AI-based PhD. And then I went from there to Siemens, where I was applying the same kind of technology into various problems in healthcare, both at in radiology, but also in vitro diagnostics as Siemens entered that space. Ultimately, as I learned more about the challenges of bringing this technology into clinical practice, I left and went to the Bay Area. I joined HeartFlow, and HeartFlow is a pure software company that was building the first computational diagnostic for coronary disease, to be able to assess coronary disease non-invasively through software. And we went through clinical trials, we went through FDA clearance, we had a NICE recommendation, Medicare reimbursement really from all of the major private players, and a change in the society guidelines for what the routine standard of care for coronary disease would be. And so that was an incredible journey. We pioneered many different areas of technology and cardiology and advancing software in this space. And so the background that I brought to Paige was being able to do those clinical trials, being able to work with the FDA to get a new kind of product, both cleared and actually incorporated and brought into routine clinical practice.
So let's dig in a little bit, and maybe you can describe to those who are watching what Paige is and what your company's product does.
So Paige focuses on pathology, and pathology is the branch of medicine where you take a piece of tissue out of a patient, a tumor, a biopsy, and you look at it under a microscope. And the idea is to make an assessment of what the underlying disease is, either cancer, not cancer, what stage, what grade, or is it something else, another type of disease or another type of pathology at the tissue level. And Paige comes from Memorial Sloan Kettering, one of the world's leading cancer hospitals, where we have worked with them and inherited the technology that was really created there, that was a new kind of a new breakthrough in artificial intelligence that also leveraged all of this, these slides that Memorial Sloan Kettering had been scanning digitally to really produce a technology that could find patterns in the pictures of these slides of these tissue and be able to match those against known patterns of cancer or other types of diseases that would really provide that information to the pathologist, to the doctor, so that they have that information for both moving through their workflow faster, but more importantly, really having the additional information to make sure that they get the diagnosis right for that patient.
So the artificial intelligence that you're using, I mean, there's a lot of different tools that are available. Obviously, you spearheaded things before, a lot of things that are just more automatic and integratable, and you don't need to do programming. I mean, AI is almost becoming like a utility or like a grid, like the electrical grid, where everybody's just kind of poking holes and pulling what they need. But you were obviously pioneers in this space. Did you actually, or did your company actually develop proprietary algorithms? I mean, is there IP associated? What is it that your company specifically built on its own?
So the foundational AI technology that really spawned Paige was developed by Thomas Fuchs and his team at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And it was an advance in artificial intelligence where it did not require an expert to look at the slide and say, these cells, those are cancer, and those cells, those are not cancer. The technology was able to look at just the diagnostic report where the pathologist had said there's cancer somewhere or there's no cancer anywhere. And by seeing enough examples of those slides and those reports to be able to understand itself what patterns were indicative of cancer and which patterns were not. And so it was this breakthrough in technology that was published in Nature Medicine last year And yes, it's patented. It was patented at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and then that technology became the foundation for Paige as it was spun out of Memorial Sloan Kettering.
So does it utilize things like image recognition, and was that integrated into the algorithm as well?
So the images are known to be prostate cancer or breast cancer or lung cancer, and the questions are clinical questions. Or sorry, that they're prostate tissue, breast tissue, lung tissue, and the questions are clinical questions. Is there cancer here? What grade is it? What stage is it at? How extensive is it? How large is it? And the technology is really intended to help the doctors not only get to those answers easier, faster, but also in a way that's more standardized and quantitative.
So before Paige came in the picture, pathologists were answering these questions themselves. So paint us the picture of like a day in the life of a pathologist world when they were looking at slides on their own, asking these important questions, and how they were filling out the report. So what is or was the traditional model of a day in the life of a pathologist?
Well, so imagine you're a pathologist and you're handed a book of glass slides, and it's your job to figure out, does this patient have cancer or not? You might pull out a slide, look at it under your microscope, and you might see something that looks a little funny, a little suspicious. And you're not sure, is that cancer? Is that not cancer? Is this an odd form of it, or is it early stage? So maybe you ask a colleague comes over, you may talk about it, confer about it. Maybe you're still not sure. You go out and you get an additional test. Maybe you send that set of slides out to another hospital, and that other hospital comes back and says, our experts looked at this and they believe that it is cancer. So that's the world of pathology so far. And imagine a different world in which the pathologist is not looking at the slide through a microscope. They're looking at it on a screen, on a monitor. The slide has been scanned and assessed by a computer. And that computer has matched all of the patterns in that tissue to known patterns for which, yes, there was cancer, no, there was not cancer. And that information is now available to the pathologist. So instead of having to ask a colleague, to be uncertain, to go get additional testing, to send those cases out, they can actually look at whether the patterns that the computer was able to match against a database is matching patients that have cancer or not, and can use that additional information to confidently make the right diagnosis for that patient.
That's fantastic, and it's really fascinating when we think about it. And part of the whole machine learning, integration of artificial intelligence is this idea of the algorithm getting smarter over time. Is that integrated as part of that patented algorithm where the more data or the more use by pathologists across the country or across the globe, the more entries, the more utilization? Is that making your algorithm smarter? Is it integrated into like a neural network of some sort?
We do use neural networks. I think the key thing to understand is that this technology is very similar to other kinds of medical technologies. If you have a diagnostic test, a blood test, a test for a disease, that test may get better over time as you find out that you need a clean blood sample, maybe it doesn't work in this population or that population. But the test doesn't just constantly change. When there's a new version of the test that incorporates this real world evidence, and that new version of the test then needs to get updated, tested, validated, gone through the regulatory bodies effectively before it can be made available to the patients. So you would never take a diagnostic test and just continually fiddle with it over time and try that on real patients in a clinical setting. If you're going to improve it in response to new data, you have to do so with a new validation protocol, a new testing protocol, and really roll out a new version. And it's the same thing for us. Our systems are going to get better over time, but they're going to do so in a controlled way as we learn. Maybe there's a certain subpopulation that doesn't work as well in, or perhaps you need to clean the slides a little bit better in this kind of situation. And as we find that out and we make a new version of it, that new version is going to be made available, but it's not going to just be changing on its own.
Yeah, and it's actually a really interesting point, because if we talk about FDA and we talk about the inclusion of these, software as a medical device and all these things, there is that technical, ethical question of at what point does a machine get smart enough, different enough, where it becomes a different entity, a different product, and that it needs to go through another FDA approval. So I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. So I just
and we take a very conservative view of that once the system is built, it's locked down, and that is what is provided to all patients until such time as there's a new version that's better than the old one, for which we can demonstrate that, validate that, and then make that one available.
Very interesting, and very similar to the way drugs are developed and approved through FDA, with additions or a change of administration route, or more data or what have you. So it sounds like a very similar process. Absolutely. So I just kind of want to linger a little bit more on this whole idea of using artificial intelligence, using something that's not human as part of this patient journey. I'm just curious about some of the challenges and barriers. Maybe I'm going to go slice at a time here, no pun intended, as a pathologist, but maybe some of the potential laxity or slowness, if you will, of uptake from stakeholders. What do you think is potentially holding some people back because of using AI?
To be honest, I think that there's one of the biggest challenges I see is people confusing a technology and a product. And AI is a technology, but it's not a product. At the end of the day, AI is a technology that can be used to build a product. And that product needs to go through trial. It needs to go through all of the paces of any kind of medical device or any kind of other sort of medical product, but it's not a product on its own. So when people think of AI, they have this idea of a robot doctor that's going to come and diagnose you, the reality is that, yes, that's one vision that some people have. I don't think that's certainly not the reality of what anybody's building or what the technology can do. The fact is, AI is all around us in a consumer space. It's already around us in a healthcare setting too. Your electronic medical record can remind you to order more inventory. Well, that's done with AI. The doctor might look at Google. That's AI. There are MRI machines and CT machines that just the nature of the way in which they take a picture now and create a CAT scan or an MRI scan is made better using AI. None of it is a robot doctor though. And so I think when you think about AI, nobody thinks about Google, nobody thinks about the EMR, nobody thinks about the creation of advanced images in a CAT scan. And so I think just in the same way with pathology, the more we can focus on the actual, what the product is doing and what the clinical benefit is, and the clinical data and evidence to support what the technology is doing, I think that's going to both communicate it better and get people to realize that this is a new advance in medical technology that's going to help them practice better. And it's not something that doesn't bear much resemblance to a clinical product.
So Leo, just help me to understand. So this software that you've developed with Paige, is it interoperable with a hospital or institution's electronic health records? How is it integrated into the system?
So when you have a set of slides for a patient that have been prepared in pathology, those slides need to get scanned. And they can get scanned through a variety of different vendors that have digital slide scanning, high throughput digital slide scanning devices. Once those slides are digitized, then those slides go into a storage system. And that storage system is something that Paige is also offering. And from there, or we can interact with others. And from there, we can then apply the software and the technology to do a preliminary assessment of those slides, to extract those patterns. And then when a pathologist sits down to look at their cases, they can have that information available to them. Once they ultimately report out their case and render a diagnosis, typically that happens in a lab information system, and then that lab information system transmits that report into the electronic medical record.
Right, excellent. I know that you were saying you worked for another company that had more of a hardware software interplay. And now with Paige, it's an all-out software play. Do you see there being advantages or of one or the other, and how do you sort of explain that?
Yeah, it's very different. So with hardware, the advantage that you have is that it's your system that's actually the sensor that's actually generating the data in the first place. So you always have control over that. You know exactly how the physics is interacting with the sensor, and you can understand the signals that are coming out of it. When you are just on the software side, you're now downstream from that. And so you can partner with the hardware vendors, as we've done at Paige with Philips, as we did at HeartFlow with Siemens and Philips and GE. But you're not in control of it in the same way that you are with hardware. I think the challenge with a hardware company in this space is that ultimately you're differentiating on the hardware. The hardware tends to be the big ticket item from a costing perspective. And so any advanced software that you build, you're not likely to want to make it interoperable with others' hardware. And so ultimately, the focus becomes the hardware and not the software. And that was one of my frustrations working at Siemens, is we had all this amazing technology, all this amazing software, and yet at the end of the day, it's almost an advertising play for the hardware, so that it was not going to be something that could have an impact broadly across the field, because it's only when they own your hardware that they're going to be able to get that software. And as somebody who's building that amazing software technology, leveraging AI and a host of other related technologies, I wanted to be in a space where we could interoperate with any hardware and have that much broader impact on the healthcare space.
So it's really interesting, Leo, because what I'm hearing you say is by playing in the software space more holistically, you're much more interoperable and more immune, and so more hardware agnostic, if you will, and more immune to some of the demonetization and commoditization that can happen with a hardware play. This is very interesting because it's unlike what we're seeing with, for example, Apple, where it seems to be a little bit more of a hardware play, where that's where they're trying to monetize, and they're, moving away from Intel and, creating their own chips. And so it's really interesting to see what angle people take either on the hardware or the software side.
Well, I think Apple is a really unique company in that way, because they are a hardware company, but they've always been a personal computing company. And so they've always looked at both hardware and software elements to create that personalized experience. iTunes, the Apple App Store. I mean, those are big, high value items for Apple as well. And it's really the holistic experience for Apple. Whereas if you look more at Samsung and Google, there's much more of a classic hardware software split there. And so I think Apple is more the exception than the rule. And particularly in healthcare, there are companies that do great hardware and software, but they're always better in one than the other. And when I was at Siemens, Siemens is an amazing engineering company. Ultimately, they're a hardware company. And although they create amazing software and they've got incredibly talented people there, the focus has always been on the hardware side.
Yeah, it is very interesting to see what side of that equation. So as Paige continues to evolve, where are you right now in terms of actual revenue generation, real B2B consumers, customers? Are you actually making money right now, or is this still going through an FDA clearance process? Sort of tell us a little bit about where you are with that.
Well, we were very excited and humbled to receive the FDA breakthrough designation for our Paige prostate product, and that was last year we received that designation. And what that means is the FDA determined that this is a technology that can significantly benefit patients and for which there's nothing like it on the market today. And when the FDA makes that determination, to date, the only determination, breakthrough designation for any AI technology in all of pathology or oncology that we're aware of. When the FDA makes that determination, it means that they commit to working with you closely to work on the protocol, work on the study, and to iterate with you in close communication, ultimately to move that technology to clearance. And so we've been very fortunate to be able to work with the FDA in that capacity and to work with them closely on defining those trials and the evidence that's necessary in order to get the product cleared. So far, we're not ready to announce clearance on that product, so we are continuing to work with them on that and moving forward with it. That same Paige prostate technology did receive a CE mark in Europe, which means that it can be used clinically in Europe. And the digital slide viewer that was first created at Memorial Sloan Kettering and then inherited by Paige also received a CE mark to be able to be used in Europe for primary diagnosis. So we're able to make those products available clinically in Europe, not yet in the US, as we work with the FDA.
So let's just say theoretically you get the final rubber stamp from the FDA. What is the natural next steps of how this is going to become an integral part of hospital pathology departments? What is that plan or route or plan of action?
Well, the technology ultimately depends on digitization. And it also depends on having that clinical evidence that suggests that this technology is providing both clinical benefit and health economics benefit. And so we've been working with a number of early access sites who have early access to the product to be able to establish that body of evidence. And we're starting to see some of those publications become public now. There was a paper in Modern Pathology last month, and we're actively working with a number of other sites to promote and publish additional work in this space. So that's really, there's the FDA part of it, being able to demonstrate safe and effective and getting that green light to be able to market and sell your product for clinical use. But even if you have that green light, if you haven't really provided the body of evidence that tells pathologists this is something that's going to help you, that's going to make your life easier, that's going to help you treat your patients more effectively, then there's going to be hesitation to go forward and adopt it. And so that's why we've been working with these early access sites to build that body of evidence, to be able to publish it and make that available. And ultimately, that's what's going to be what moves the field forward in pathology.
So I just kind of want to linger a little bit more on that whole FDA process. I'm assuming we're calling this real world evidence collection, and the whole process around that. And with that as well too is a whole question around how you're involving patients, like the patient centricity part of this. Are patients involved at all? There's one thing about involving patients as it relates to end products or end use, but are patients being brought in on the diagnosis piece of the equation? Are they being involved in the development of these sorts of studies and evaluation of diagnostics?
Typically, the first place to start when you're building evidence for a new technology is with retrospective studies. So that's exactly what we've been engaging in with a number of partner sites, where we're looking at patients that have already been treated. They've already had the course of their disease managed based on the decisions and the technology available at that time. And we're taking a second look at those cases and saying, if we'd had Paige, what would we have done? How does that match up with what actually was done? How does that match up with the trajectory of these patients and the ultimate outcomes of those patients? So that's been the first place to start. Ultimately, is you get to a point where you want to make a prospective statement about the care of patients. That's when you have to enroll them into a trial, and that's when you would be getting informed consent from those patients and working with them in order to be able to do that prospective trial. In that sense, it's really like every other medical device out there.
Right. Now, the other part to all of this is there's an important piece eventually, if it does get approved by the FDA as an important clinical diagnostic, is who's going to pay for this. So as we start to think about Medicaid, Medicare, patients paying it for themselves and looking at the value proposition, this is really interesting because it's a diagnostic. It's not a medication. And sometimes there isn't anything specific that results from it, like hardcore metrics like reduced number of hospitalizations or reduced waiting times. Those are things that have really concrete metrics. How is Paige trying to frame out the value proposition for your product around efficiency, missed detections, those sorts of errors? How do you economize those or put those into actual value terms?
Yeah, if you look at that's a great question. If you look at the Modern Pathology paper that was just published, what was shown there on a small study is that what we looked at was pathologists that were looking at slides and doing their diagnosis, and then they went home for 5 weeks. They came back and they did their diagnosis a second time on the same slides, but the second time they used Paige. They had the information available from Paige that said, this area of the case is suspicious for cancer, and it called their attention to those areas. And what we found in that paper is that, or in that study, which was published in the paper, was that when pathologists had that additional information, that they were much more likely to avoid missing cancers. So the number of false negatives went dramatically down when they were using Paige and they had the additional information from Paige. And particularly in smaller cancers that were still clinically significant. And so if you translate that into health economics terms, there have been a number of publications on how do you quantify the costs of every case or every diagnostic error. And there have been a number of studies around this. The number that I see most common in these publications is about $21,000 per error in pathology. And that's across all different types and subspecialties. But if you take that number and you say, okay, well, if the introduction of Paige is able to substantially reduce the number of missed cancers, the number of errors, then that has a clear patient benefit. It also has a clear economic benefit for the hospital and for the doctors.
Have you been able, or is there any papers or written reports on the other side of that, which is the false, I mean, obviously might be an ethical question, but false positives, where somebody might have been treated for a cancer that they might not have had at a specific degree, what have you, and there was a whole assortment of costs associated with a treatment that might have been falsely administered? Or is that an ethical place that, you know, Paige and others don't really necessarily want to run down?
Well, it's very important, as you said. I mean, a patient that gets treated incorrectly I mean, that can lead to tragic consequences. I've read several accounts of patients that had treatment for benign lesions. I read one account of a woman who had a double mastectomy and full chemotherapy because there was a false reading of cancer on her pathology report. These are very serious situations, and I do think that Paige has an opportunity to help with those as well. When we look at the data from that study that was published in Modern Pathology, what we found is that there was no significant difference statistically in the rate of false positives, that the really big difference there was in the rate of false negatives. So missing cancer that was actually there. So at least in that study, that was really demonstrating the benefit of the technology for that case. I think subsequent studies are going to have to look at the case that you bring up of false positives and unnecessary treatments.
So these are two really interesting questions for hospitals, economies, patients, and everybody and all involved stakeholders. On the one hand, if Paige is able to effectively diagnose patients who might have been falsely detected as being negative, is there a possibility that health systems may want to rebut against Paige because of concerns of economic feasibility of suddenly entering a whole series of patients that they may not have had to entertain earlier? Is this an economic question or an ethical question that might have come up, you know, either directly or indirectly to Paige?
Ultimately, Paige, doctors, healthcare providers are trying to provide the best care for patients. And that is the primary driving force of the healthcare system. And there have been known examples in the past in which economic incentives were such that patients didn't always get the best care because of the economics associated with that. In this case, the economics are well aligned, because if you miss cancer on a patient and they come back with stage 4, now they're on chemotherapy, and now they're getting surgery, and now they're on life support or palliative care, that is much more costly to deal with from a healthcare system, from a payer standpoint, than catching it early. Obviously, it's most importantly, it's better for the patient to catch it early. But from a health economic standpoint, it's also much better to catch it early.
That's actually a really, really important point. I think that's an important caveat to make for sure. Now, on this note, again, on the side of the equation of being able to detect earlier and more, there's obviously a lot of people with a vested interest in that, mainly pharmaceutical companies and companies who have really good, viable prostate cancer products amidst others. And I'm sure there's other things that you're looking at further down the pipeline. Are you partnering with pharmaceutical companies? Are these discussions that you're having for ongoing real world evidence clinical studies for further discovery? What are you doing around partnerships?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a partnership with a number of big biopharma companies. And that's to look at the application of our existing technology, but also to go beyond what is known visibly within the tissue. And what I mean by that is that there's substantial evidence at this point that there are characteristics of certain tumors, of certain microenvironments with surrounding tumors that indicate certain mutations, indicate certain protein expressions, indicate the capability of certain drugs to be more effective or less effective. And because of our relationship with Memorial Sloan Kettering and because of our unique technology, we're able to look at those questions in a way that has not been possible before. And so we are actively working with a number of biopharmas to really identify computational assays, computational biomarkers that can help determine whether or not a patient's going to respond to a certain therapy. And I'll give you one example, which was just made public at ASCO, where we're working with Janssen. And what we showed there is that they had a problem, which is that they were looking at the application of a therapy in a neoadjuvant setting for patients with prostate cancer, meaning they were going to give the drug to the patient before surgery, and then they wanted to know, is that enough or do they need to do more? And when you then remove the patient's prostate out and you look at it, the question that they wanted to know the answer to is there any cancer left, or did we get it all with the therapy that we administered? The problem of trying to answer that question is that the act of administering the therapy had an effect on the tissue such that it was damaged, that it was warped, that it was very difficult to distinguish even what normal tissue looked like, much less to accurately determine whether there was any cancer left. So their approach had been to look at whether or not it was possible to have an elite set of pathologists who were trained, who could then go through and make that assessment of, is there cancer left even in these treatment damaged prostates? And when working together with them, we were able to show that the Paige prostate system was able to identify residual cancer in these prostates, even though they had been damaged by the tissue. And what that opens up is an opportunity to standardize how residual cancer gets measured, pathological complete response gets measured, to make it available for trials, for studies to really look at this. But then ultimately, as it's proven to be a companion diagnostic or a complementary diagnostic, then to be able to roll it out and make it available clinically for the clinical assessment of pathological complete response in order to determine whether or not a patient can stop therapy or they need to go on.
So you were talking about partnerships with big biopharmaceutical companies, but one of the other ideas that comes to mind is that we're now in a space of completely uber personalized medicine, almost to the point where futuristically you could almost look at the end of one, medical intervention, on a patient by patient level, and that's a bit sci-fi right now. But ultimately, the bridge towards that is really going to be on these optimal diagnostics and coming up with really personalized ways of approaching disease. So where do you see Paige fitting in, not only in partnering with biopharmaceutical, but with diagnostic companies? And really my next question is does Paige become a diagnostic company? Do you create new biomarkers? And are you the new creators and innovators of these things that we were going to diagnostic companies for?
I think that is a very astute observation about the direction of this technology. I think let me answer that question by giving you an example from HeartFlow. So at HeartFlow, we were assessing coronary disease, but we weren't doing it from kind of population-based studies. What we were doing is we were building a 3D computational model of your heart, of that patient's heart, of that patient's coronary arteries, of that patient's blood flow through those coronary arteries. And by doing so, we could assess not only do you have a stenosis that requires treatment or not, but we could really pinpoint the severity of the treatment or the severity of the disease, the locations of the disease. And then we took it a step further, which was the ability to put a virtual stent into the coronary and say, if I put a stent in this patient at this location of this length, how does that restore blood flow? And ultimately what that means, and that's an FDA cleared product that's available today. And what that means is that for that patient, on a completely personalized setting, you can say, for your heart, for your disease, this treatment is going to treat you effectively. And if we consider that same concept, that same paradigm in an oncology setting, the cancer setting, if we can really understand a tumor, if we can understand the tissue and the microenvironment, and we can understand how that relates to the rest of the patient and the disease, we should be able to calculate what's going to be the effect of this treatment, what's going to be the effect of this therapy, and assess whether it's going to be more effective or less effective for this patient. And that capability, that computational capability, is personalization not only at the patient level, but at the tumor level, at the tissue level, at the specimen level, to say this drug is going to effectively treat this patient right now. And so with those computational capabilities, as we build those out, I think it's going to go in exactly the direction that you're saying, that Paige is going to be able to provide that kind of technology first to the therapeutic companies that say, okay, this therapy is going to work, this therapy is not. Maybe you should actually consider something like this that might work better in this situation. And then as we engage with them and build out those capabilities and prove it through classical clinical trials, to make that capability available to doctors, to hospitals, to patients that want to know exactly how do I treat my disease.
So I'm just going to take the other side to this. We were talking about a lot of the pros, and one of the things that kind of comes to mind as we talk about the two sides to the coin is the other side, where we're looking at the possible false positives. Actually, I might say the ones where there was actually, no disease, or there was disease, and whatever ramifications happened as a result of an incomplete or incorrect diagnosis. And now that you were saying that there's a lot of retrospective studies that can happen, and then you can verify what happened or what didn't, is there a possibility that there could be some pushback from the pathology community with concerns of potential lawsuits or other negative repercussions that could happen as a result of looking backwards retrospectively on decisions that were made? And is there concerns about that?
Well, I think you're right that it's something that we all need to be sensitive to, right? Because, for example, if you were to do a retrospective study and you find out that a patient was not adequately treated and that they ultimately had an adverse outcome, then that knowledge after the fact could create challenges for that hospital. Any study that we're doing retrospectively is not unique in this sense, right? Any time you would go back and do a retrospective study with any sort of new medical device, you can ask those same questions, even if it's a new pathway for the patient. I mean, as societies look at new guidelines and look at whether or not certain patients could have been treated better if they'd gone through this pathway or that pathway, they run into the same issue. And so there are mechanisms in place that allow you to engage with a hospital, and in the interest of patient safety, in the interest of improving healthcare, to be able to engage in those kinds of studies in a way that limits the liability for a hospital to look at it and to get that information. Because the last thing that we want as a society is that hospitals just put their head down and they say, well, I'd rather not know. No, of course we want them to know. As a patient, you want them to know if there's a better way of doing something, so that next time they'll be able to do it in that way.
Eric Topol has written a lot of really amazing forward-thinking books on technology and what it means. I mean, he's probably one of the #1 sort of physicians who's in this space. And one of the concerns, obviously, is about roboticizing or automating people, things, specifically clinicians. Is there potentially some backlash to the automated pathologist in the world that you're creating, that maybe one day, if Paige is good enough and shows almost stellar abilities and efficiency above and beyond what is being shown through the human, is there any concerns that are kind of bubbling up from the pathology community about ousting the pathologists out of their jobs?
I think this goes back to the earlier part of our discussion where we were talking about AI. What is AI? And I think if somebody, by using that term or overusing that term or thinking about that term as the goal, that suggests that you're trying to build a robot doctor, an automated doctor. And that is, in my view, a very extreme way of thinking about the trajectory of this technology. Just like Google, just like the EMR, just like all of these things that are already using AI, is providing new information to doctors, helping them do their job. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to leverage this technology in a way that gives them new information, that gives them new diagnostic information to help them make better decisions for their patients. And so I certainly think that if you engage too much in a conversation about AI, that tends to be the direction that the conversation goes. And it's why I really think that I think it's a distraction, to be honest, because the technology that we have today and that we continue to build can do many things that couldn't be done before, that really provides substantial clinical value, that has proven clinical value. And in that way, it's no different than any other medical device, any other diagnostic. And I think by considering it in that framework and proving it and doing the clinical studies, that's what's really going to demonstrate to the pathologists that this technology, this new product, this new device is going to help them better treat their patients. Beautiful. And that's been our focus at Paige.
And I love the work that you're doing, obviously a very important space in the oncology world. There's a lot going on there. So it sounds like you're starting in prostate and then going into breast and lung. Just out of curiosity, in terms of future thinking and the fact that you have a cognitive neuroscience background, and thinking about the world that we're in post-COVID pandemic, during pandemic, however you want to word it, where we are today in the pandemic, and thinking about the ramifications of the mental health space, the wellness, the areas around neural places and cognitive whatever. Is there going to be some futuristic way or mechanism that companies like a Paige are going to be able to make, mental health biological, where there's actually going to be systems for measurement and metrics to evaluate certain mental conditions and PTSD and anxiety before it happens, before it hits really hard? What is the future of Paige? And I'm just saying that might be one area, that might not even be the area. So what is the future for Paige?
Well, in the context of mental health, I don't know that that is the direction that Paige is going to be operating in. There's been a lot of work in the scientific literature of computational assessment of certain mental conditions, trying to understand at a biological sense what is Alzheimer's, what is Parkinson's, what is anxiety, what is depression, how do we treat it, what are the mechanisms, how do you detect it, how do you quantify it? And that work continues, and I think there have been some successes. I think there's a long way to go there. From the standpoint of Paige, we're very focused on cancer and being able to leverage the technology that we have to enable pathologists to be more effective, more efficient, to get more information in the treatment and diagnosis of their patients, and then at the same time build additional biomarkers and diagnostics with the biopharma industry that can help assess what the right treatment is, whether a certain drug or a certain therapy is going to be more effective or less effective on this patient specifically, and then ultimately make that available to hospitals and physicians and patients as well. So that's our focus at Paige.
I love it, and very, very exciting about the kind of work that you're doing, integrating AI in a very practical, non-abstract way, something that's actually tangible, usable, interoperable with electronic health records, and going through the required FDA process. I think this makes this very real. So very exciting work. Thank you very, very much, Leo. I could be asking you questions for hours. This is an awesome, exciting topic. And again, just as a reminder, these are the kinds of conversations that we want to have. These courageous conversations, these positively disruptive conversations in healthcare with all the different stakeholders, pharmaceutical, medical devices, other stakeholders. We are the bridge of this at Impetus Digital with our asynchronous and our synchronous virtual collaboration platform, getting beyond the pill, getting beyond the average, and doing something a little different. So please be on the lookout. We will be sending an email with a link to this webinar if you want to share this with your friends. We'll be posting this on our YouTube and podcast channel, as well as Twitter and other social media. And feel free to take a look at this. Thank you very much, Leo, and really appreciate your time today. And wishing you and Paige much success in the future.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's been a real pleasure to join you today.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.